Have you ever considered that some places don't disappear but simply phase out of existence? My name is Arthur Vance. For decades, I've chased the phantom echoes of forgotten histories, the whispers of places that vanished from maps but not from memory. What I discovered about the Ashworth family of Whisperwood Hollow, nestled deep in the rugged heart of eastern Kentucky, changed everything I thought I knew about history, reality, and the terrifying power of a single bloodline. It began in the late 1880s, not with a burst of violence or a grand declaration, but with the subtle creep of something fundamentally unnatural. Silas Ashworth arrived in Whisperwood Hollow in 1887. He didn't come with wagons laden with possessions or deeds proclaiming ownership. He simply was there. Locals, those few who even remembered his arrival, spoke of him materializing, a gaunt figure emerging from the mist-shrouded peaks during a particularly brutal winter. He carried nothing but a well-worn leather satchel and a presence that made even the most hardened mountain folk feel disquieted. Silas possessed an unnerving talent, an intuitive grasp of the hollow itself. He seemed to know precisely where forgotten springs bubbled, where game would gather, and more chillingly, exactly what secrets each family held closest to their hearts, unlike typical settlers who struggled to tame the wild Appalachian terrain. Silas Ashworth moved through Whisperwood Hollow as if he were simply reacquainting himself with a place he already owned. His homestead, which he called the Hearthstone, didn't rise through brute force or conventional construction. It grew. Neighbors who lent a hand in the early days reported peculiar things. Lumber laid down one evening might be fitted perfectly into a wall by dawn without any sound of work through the night. Foundations seemed to sink into the earth, then reappear reinforced, as if the ground itself conspired in its construction. The Hearthstone wasn't just a house. It became a living structure, its timber and stone seeming to breathe with a slow, deliberate pulse. This uncanny efficiency immediately set the Ashworths apart, forging an early reputation that blended awe with a deep, unspoken fear. Silas never asked for anything outright. Instead, he simply appeared at homesteads precisely when desperation gnawed deepest. When the Miller family's eldest daughter, Mary, fell victim to a sudden fever that baffled the local physician, Silas arrived, not with herbs or poultices, but with a strangely compelling silence. He would sit by Mary's bedside, simply watching, and within hours the fever would break, her breathing easing. When the seasonal blight threatened the Caldwell family's entire corn crop, Silas would walk their fields, touching individual stalks, and within days the blight would recede, leaving behind a harvest miraculously untouched. These weren't acts of charity. They were calculated interventions designed to create profound, almost existential, dependency. What recipients of Ashworth aid noticed was a subtle alteration in their own memories. After Silas had cured Mary Miller, her parents, despite their overwhelming gratitude, found they couldn't quite recall the severity of her illness. The moments of feverish delirium, the doctor's grim prognosis, these details softened, becoming indistinct, replaced by a clear, unshakable memory of Silas's calm, reassuring presence. The Caldwells, after their miraculously saved crop, found themselves unable to pinpoint exactly when the blight had threatened. It became a vague, distant worry, overshadowed by the memory of Silas's firm hand on their stalks and the subsequent abundance. It was as if the Ashworths weren't just solving problems, but subtly editing the very fabric of local memory, weaving themselves into the past as indispensable saviors. As the years passed, Silas's influence deepened. His children, Thomas and Elira, inherited and expanded upon their father's unsettling gifts. Thomas, the eldest, possessed an almost instinctual connection to the land itself. He didn't farm. He seemed to commune with the soil, the water, the trees. Farmers would seek his counsel for crop rotation or well digging, and Thomas would simply gesture towards a patch of barren earth or a dry riverbed, speaking in low, guttural tones that sounded like the earth groaning. Invariably, a new spring would emerge, or a previously fallow field would burst forth with unexpected abundance. His touch could coax life from stone or wither it from fertile ground with equal ease. Elira, Silas's daughter, was the family's master of human dynamics. She rarely spoke, but her presence was a palpable force. When community members gathered at the Hearthstone for informal consultations, which quickly became mandatory, Elira would listen, her eyes, the same unnerving shade of gray as her father's, fixating on individuals. People would find themselves confessing fears and anxieties they hadn't known they possessed, or revealing intimate details about their neighbors without conscious intent. Elira's silence was more eloquent, more manipulative than any speech. She could resolve festering feuds between families with a single, knowing glance, or sow discord between allies with an imperceptible shift in her posture. Her true power lay in her ability to manipulate perception itself. Those who opposed the Ashworths found their reputations inexplicably tarnished, their words twisted, their good intentions perceived as malice by those who had once trusted them implicitly. It was a subtle, insidious form of social architecture, reshaping the community from within the hearthstone, meanwhile, continued its organic growth. What started as a modest cabin evolved into a sprawling, illogical structure of converging angles and shifting passages. Visitors reported a pervasive sense of disorientation within its walls. Rooms would subtly change size or shape between visits, staircases would lead to unexpected landings, and the air itself seemed to hum with an almost hypnotic resonance. Local craftsmen, paid handsomely in unmarked gold coins by the Ashworths, would work for weeks within the compound, only to emerge disoriented, unable to account for the passage of time, their memories of the interior hazy and contradictory. This ever-shifting architecture wasn't merely a curiosity. It was a physical manifestation of the Ashworths' growing power over reality, a training ground for their manipulation of perception. The true horror began with the Ashworths' gatherings, which replaced traditional town hall meetings. Held monthly in the Hearthstone's central, subtly angled great room, these were not democratic forums, but ritualistic sessions of what I've come to call whisperweaving. Under the soft, droning cadence of Silas's voice and the pervasive, almost musical hum of the Hearthstone itself, community members were encouraged to share their truths, their anxieties, their desires, their interpretations of past events. But the Ashworths subtly guided these narratives. A memory of a harsh winter and widespread starvation might, by the end of a gathering, be recalled as a period of gentle scarcity overcome by collective ingenuity, all subtly guided by the foresight of Silas Ashworth. Ilara would sit, eyes half closed, occasionally making a soft, almost imperceptible gesture, and a memory would shift, a perspective would alter, a truth would be collectively rewritten. This created a profound, shared delusion. The community didn't just believe the Ashworths were their saviors, they remembered them always having been. By the early 1900s, Whisperwood Hollow was an anomaly. Its inhabitants were strangely content, prosperous in ways that defied regional economic hardship, and fiercely loyal to the Ashworth family. They rarely left the Hollow, claiming a deep-seated preference for their home, but outsiders who managed to visit noticed their peculiar unanimity of thought. Speak to one resident about a past event, then another, and you'd hear almost identical accounts, down to specific turns of phrase, even if the individuals were separated by miles and hadn't spoken in weeks. This wasn't merely social cohesion, it was a terrifying echo of the Ashworth children's early thought synchronization, expanded to an entire community. The family's influence began to spread beyond the Hollow, not through conquest, but through a gradual, almost cellular assimilation. Families in neighboring valleys, facing economic ruin or personal tragedy, would often find an Ashworth agent appearing on their doorstep. These were always young men or women, never direct descendants of Silas, but rather adopted children who had undergone the Ashworth conditioning. They would offer assistance, guidance, and the promise of a better life in Whisperwood Hollow. Desperate, vulnerable families would agree to relocate, drawn by the irresistible pull of the Ashworth's crafted reality. These new arrivals, upon entering Whisperwood Hollow, would slowly begin to shed their old memories, their independent thoughts, their very identities, becoming another harmonious voice in the collective chorus of Ashworth devotion. It was like watching a slow, deliberate bloom of a sentient fungus, silently consuming and repurposing everything it touched. This is where I, Arthur Vance, enter the story. I was a young journalist in the early 1940s, driven by a fascination with Appalachian folklore and forgotten communities. I'd heard whispers of Whisperwood Hollow, a valley that rarely appeared on maps, whose residents were said to be unnaturally prosperous, but strangely uniform. My editor, a man named Henderson who had a peculiar fondness for the unexplained, funded my expedition in 1943. I remember my initial approach to Whisperwood Hollow. The road simply ended. One moment I was on a logging trail, the next a wall of unbroken forest, but something urged me forward. It wasn't a road I found, but a feeling, a subtle shift in the air, a scent of damp earth and something indefinable, almost metallic. Then the trees parted, not abruptly, but as if they had simply allowed me passage. I saw it then. Whisperwood Hollow. It wasn't a sprawling town, but a collection of well-kept homesteads, each seemingly prosperous. And at its heart, the hearthstone, a structure that defied geometric logic, its angles seeming to shift as I looked at it. I was welcomed not with suspicion, but with a serene, almost detached cordiality. The residents were remarkably polite, eager to speak. But their words were too perfect. I spoke to a man named Jedediah Morrison, whose family had been in the region for generations. He recounted the harsh winter of 1887, how his kin were on the brink of starvation until Silas Ashworth, a man of profound foresight, appeared with supplies and knowledge. Yet when I pressed him for details, the hunger, the desperation, the names of the dead, his eyes would glaze over. There was no great suffering, he'd say, for Silas was always there. His account mirrored that of Martha Caldwell and young Elias Vance, no relation to me, thankfully, or so I hoped then, and every other resident I interviewed. They were all speaking from the same script, a carefully woven narrative of perpetual prosperity under Ashworth guidance. The Ashworths themselves were unsettling. Silas was still alive, despite appearing to be well over 80. His eyes still held that unnerving depth, but now they seemed to reflect not just light, but faint, shifting patterns of what looked like constellations. Thomas moved with an unnatural fluidity, his hands often brushing against the ground as he walked, and Elira had a way of looking at you that made your thoughts feel like whispers in your own head. They invited me to a gathering. The hearthstone's central chamber was more disorienting inside than out. The curved walls amplified certain sounds, muffling others. As Silas began to speak, his voice a low, rhythmic drone, I felt a strange lethargy wash over me. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of pine and something else, something sweet and cloying. People began to speak, sharing their truths, their voices blending into a soft, murmuring current. I watched as memories seemed to visibly reshape in their eyes, doubts draining away, replaced by tranquil certainty. I felt myself losing focus, my own memories blurring at the edges. I remember fighting it, gripping my pen so hard my knuckles turned white, whispering my name, my mission. Anything to anchor myself to my own reality. It was Elira who noticed my resistance. Her gaze sharpened, piercing the haze that had begun to settle over me. For a moment I saw past her composed exterior, glimpsing something ancient, something cold and vast behind her eyes. It was like looking into a deep, starless void, a place where individual thought held no meaning. A shiver, not of cold, but of profound existential dread, ran through me. In that instant, I knew. This wasn't just psychological manipulation. This was something deeper, something that warped the very fabric of being. They weren't just changing minds, they were changing reality. I left Whisperwood Hollow that night, my departure unnoticed. My notes were scattered, my mind reeling. The clear, logical thoughts I'd brought with me felt like wet sand slipping through my fingers. I remembered my objective, but the details, the burning urgency had softened. I tried to report what I'd seen, but my words felt hollow, unbelievable even to my own ears. Henderson, my editor, listened patiently, but I saw the doubt in his eyes. He classified my expedition as reporter's fatigue. I felt like a man who had seen a color no one else could perceive, and was now being told it didn't exist 4 years. I haunted libraries, archives, old maps, chasing the feeling that Whisperwood Hollow was more than a forgotten place. I knew what I had experienced was real, but it was like trying to grasp smoke. No official records of the Ashworths beyond the earliest fragmented land deeds, no consistent census data. The very existence of Whisperwood Hollow on maps was inconsistent, sometimes there, sometimes not, or depicted as a vast, unnamed forest. It was as if the valley itself was flickering in and out of our shared reality. Then, in the summer of 1968, a forest fire swept through a remote section of eastern Kentucky, coincidentally near where I believed Whisperwood Hollow to be. Driven by an old reporter's instinct, I drove there, armed with outdated maps and a gut feeling that had never truly abandoned me. The fire had cleared a vast swathe of land, exposing rock formations that had been hidden for centuries. And there, amidst the charred landscape, was a peculiar anomaly. A circular patch of ground, utterly untouched by the flames. No trees grew there, no underbrush, just bare, gray earth radiating a faint, almost imperceptible warmth. It was centered on where my old maps indicated the hearthstone would have stood. As I walked onto that bare patch of earth, a profound stillness settled over me, much like the one I had experienced when entering the hollow decades before. The air was unnervingly silent, not even the chirping of crickets or the rustle of distant wind. I felt a distinct pressure, like water pressing against my eardrums or two realities trying to occupy the same space. My compass spun wildly, then locked north, only to spin again. My watch, a reliable military-grade timepiece, began to gain and lose time in erratic bursts. I saw faint, shimmering distortions in the air, like heat haze, but there was no heat, only that unsettling warmth from the ground. It was like looking through a warped pane of glass at another dimension, barely visible. Then I saw it. A glint of something metal half buried in the gray earth. I dug it out with my hands. It was a small brass locket, tarnished but intact. I opened it. Inside was a miniature portrait of a young woman, perhaps in her late teens, with wide, unsettling gray eyes. And carved into the brass on the back, almost too small to read, was a name. Elara Ashworth. But what truly chilled me to my core was not the discovery of the locket itself, but the reflection of my own face in its polished interior. It was me, yes, but younger, sharper. And in my eyes I saw a faint, gray flicker, almost imperceptible but undeniably there. A flicker that reminded me chillingly of the Ashworths. The chilling twist isn't that the Ashworths vanished. It's that they didn't. They achieved something far more profound and terrifying. They didn't just control Whisperwood Hollow. They subtly, meticulously, phase-shifted it out of our conventional reality. They warped the space, the time, and the very perception of those within it, creating a self-contained pocket dimension, a living, breathing illusion that only occasionally brushes against our world. The Hearthstone wasn't just a house. It was the anchor, the nexus of their engineered reality. The fire of 1968 didn't burn Whisperwood Hollow because it simply wasn't there in the same way. It had stepped sideways, a reality construct that had become too powerful for our world to hold. The Ashworths didn't disappear. They ascended, taking their loyal, mind-wiped community with them, into a reality where they were the architects of truth, memory, and existence itself. They created a perfect prison where everyone believed they were free, and that prison then became an entire world. The legacy of the Ashworths persists in the subtle anomalies that federal monitoring stations, disguised as weather facilities, still detect in that remote region. Geometric patterns in satellite imagery where no structures exist. Electromagnetic disturbances that defy scientific explanation. The occasional, inexplicable appearance of strange flora or fauna not native to Kentucky. And sometimes, on nights when the mist hangs heavy and low, hikers venturing too close to that barren patch of earth report hearing faint, rhythmic chanting, a murmur of many voices, speaking in perfect, unsettling unison. I retired from journalism a few years after that. My colleagues say I've grown quieter, more reflective. Sometimes, when I catch my reflection, I still see that flicker in my eyes. And sometimes I find myself thinking thoughts, recalling events that I'm certain aren't my own. I remember things that didn't happen, places that don't exist, and a profound, quiet contentment that feels both alien and deeply familiar. It's as if a tiny piece of Whisperwood Hollow, a fragment of that rewritten reality, has clung to me, woven itself into my own consciousness. The Ashworths taught me that control isn't about force. It's about consensus, about the subtle manipulation of perception until an entire world and the memories of those who live in it become exactly what you desire. And sometimes, I wonder if a piece of me isn't still in that hollow, a silent, willing participant in a reality I can no longer fully remember or entirely escape. The most terrifying Appalachian families aren't just buried in the earth. Some of them are building new worlds just beyond our sight and waiting for us to join them. What's the most unsettling historical mystery you've ever heard? Share it in the comments below.